might attack their flank from the south. Usually the great gambler, he could not believe his luck. Memories of 1914, when the invasion of France had been thwarted by a counterattack in their flank, also haunted the older generals. General Oberst von Rundstedt agreed with Hitler, and on the 16th of May he ordered Kleist to halt his panzer divisions to allow the infantry to catch up. But General Halder, a late convert to the audacity of Manstein's plan, urged him to keep going. Kleist and Guderian had another row the next day, with Kleist quoting Hitler's order. But a compromise was reached, allowing battle-worthy reconnaissance formations to probe towards the coast, while 19 Corps headquarters stayed where it was. This gave Guderian the chance he wanted. Unlike Hitler in his Filzen nest, he knew that the French were paralyzed by the audacity of the German strike. Only isolated pockets of resistance remained, with the remnants of some French divisions fighting on in the face of disaster. By coincidence, on the same day that the panzer divisions were halted and took a much-needed opportunity to rest and service their vehicles, a French counterattack took place from the south. Colonel Charles de Gaulle, the foremost proponent of armored warfare in the French army, who had thus made himself very unpopular with the elderly, fixed-line generals, had just been given command of the so-called 4th Armored Division. De Gaulle's passionate advocacy of mechanized warfare had led to his nickname of Colonel Motors. But the 4th Armored was an ill-assorted collection of tank battalions with little infantry support and almost no artillery. General Georges briefed him and sent him on his way with the words, "Go on, de Gaulle. For you who have so long held the ideas which the enemy is putting into practice, here is the chance to act." De Gaulle was longing to attack, having heard of the insolence of German panzer crews. As they charged past French troops on the road, they simply told them to throw down their weapons and march eastward. Their casual, parting cry, "We haven't got time to take you prisoner," outraged his patriotism. From Laon, de Gaulle decided to strike northeast towards Montcornet, an important road junction on Guderian's supply route. The 4th Armored Division's sudden advance took the Germans by surprise and nearly overran the headquarters of the 1st Panzer Division. But the Germans reacted with great speed, using a few tanks which had just been repaired and some self-propelled guns. Air support from the Luftwaffe was called in, and de Gaulle's battered force, lacking any anti-aircraft guns and fighter cover, was obliged to withdraw. Guderian, needless to say, did not inform Rundstedt's Army Group headquarters about the action that day. The BEF, which had fought off German attacks on its sector of the Dyle, was astonished on the evening of the 15th of May when it heard by chance that General Gaston Bilotte, the 1st Army Group commander, was preparing to withdraw to the line of the river Escaut. This meant abandoning Brussels and Antwerp. Belgian generals only discovered the decision the following morning and were furious at the lack of warning. Bilotte's headquarters were in a state of psychological collapse, with many officers in tears. Gord's chief of staff was so horrified by what he had heard from the British liaison officer that he rang the War Office in London to warn them that the BEF might have to be evacuated at some point. For the British, the 16th of May marked the start of a fighting retreat. Just south of Brussels, on a ridge near Waterloo, Royal Artillery batteries with 25-pounders took up position. This time their guns were aimed towards Wavre, from where the Prussians had come to help their forebears in 1815. But by the following night, German troops were entering the Belgian capital. That day, Reynaud sent a signal to General Maxime Weygand in Syria, asking him to fly back to France to take over the supreme command. He had decided to get rid of Gamelin, whatever Daladier said. He also intended to change his ministers. Georges Mandel, who had been the former Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau's right-hand man and was determined to fight on to the end, would become Minister of the Interior. Reynaud himself took on the Ministry of War and planned to bring in Charles de Gaulle, now with the temporary rank of a junior general, as Under-Secretary of State. Reynaud was confirmed in his decision when he heard the next day from the writer André Mauroy working as a liaison officer, that although the British were fighting well, they had lost all confidence in the French army, and especially its senior commanders. Yet Renaud made a fatal mistake at the same time, probably influenced by his capitular mistress, Hélène de Portes. He sent a representative to Madrid to persuade Marshal Philippe Pétain, then France's ambassador to Franco, to become his deputy prime minister. Pétain's prestige as the victor of Verdun had given him heroic status. But the 84-year-old marshal, like Weygand, was more preoccupied by a fear of revolution and of the disintegration of the French army than by the prospect of defeat. He, like many on the right, believed that France had been unfairly pushed into this war by the British. On the morning of the 18th of May, 1940, just 8 days after Churchill had become Prime Minister, and while the Germans were threatening to encircle the BEF in northern France, Randolph Churchill visited his father. The Prime Minister, who was shaving, told him to read the paper until he had finished. But then he suddenly said, "I think I see my way through," and returned to scraping away. His astounded son replied, "Do you mean that we can avoid defeat? Or beat the bastards?" Churchill put down his razor and turned round. "Of course I mean we can beat them." "Well, I'm all for it, but I don't see how you can do it." His father dried his face before saying with great intensity, "I shall drag the United States in." By chance, it was also the day on which the government, at Halifax's urging, sent the austere socialist Sir Stafford Cripps to Moscow to seek better relations with the Soviet Union. Churchill felt that Cripps was a bad choice on the grounds that Stalin hated socialists almost more than he hated conservatives. He also thought that the high-minded Cripps was hardly the person to deal with a rough, suspicious, and calculating cynic like Stalin. Yet Cripps was a good deal more far-sighted than the Prime Minister in some directions. He had already predicted that the war would bring an end to the British Empire and introduce fundamental social change afterwards. On the 19th of May, the Panzer Corridor, as the German salient became known, now extended across the Canal du Nord. Both Guderian and Rommel needed to rest their crews, but Rommel persuaded his corps commander that he should push on that night towards Arras. The RAF contingent in France was now completely cut off from British forces on the ground, so the decision was taken to return the 66 remaining Hurricanes in France back to Britain. The French, of course, felt betrayed by this move, but the loss of airfields and the exhaustion of the pilots made it unavoidable. The RAF had already lost a quarter of its total fighter force in the Battle of France. Far to the south that day, General Erwin von Witzleben's First Army made the first breach in the Maginot Line. This was designed to prevent the French from sending troops up against the southern flank of the Panzer Corridor, even though that flank had begun to be protected by German infantry divisions arriving exhausted from forced marches. Colonel de Gaulle launched another attack that day northwards with 150 tanks towards Crécy-sur-Serre. He had been promised fighter cover by the French Air Force to ward off Stuka attacks, but bad communications meant that they arrived too late. De Gaulle had to pull his battered remnants back across the River Aisne. Bad liaison between the Allied armies continued, and this led to suspicions that the BEF was already preparing to evacuate.